Hello, new prospect. Welcome to RTB 2021 for September the 21st, 2021. Hope you're doing well on this day. So our text for today, we've got 2 Samuel 17, 2 Corinthians 10, Ezekiel 24, one of the more shocking texts in the book of Ezekiel, if we haven't encountered a few of those already, and then Psalm 72. So let's jump right on in, and I'm in Ezekiel, so why don't we just start here. So Ezekiel's 24 has two separate, what we would call sign acts. Remember what a sign act is where God gives Ezekiel a message that he is to act out, and then there's this interpretation of the act. Well, the first of these is a boiling pot that is referred to a little bit earlier in the book of Ezekiel, maybe in chapter 11. And in this text, we have this boiling pot again, and once again, it's representative of the judgment that's going to come on Israel. And this pot has uncleanness. There's this rust within the pot, and of course, this is of course representative of the lewdness and the filthiness of Judah itself. And he ends this prophecy by poetic rendering where he says that you will not be cleansed from your filthiness again until I've spent my wrath upon you. So things are coming to a head here, really, and in this section of Ezekiel where it's speaking of really for many chapters now that have spoken of Israel's coming doom, Judah's coming doom, Jerusalem's fall at the hands of the Babylonians. It's going to switch here in chapter 25 and move to some judgments against the nation. So really, remember that in Ezekiel, the first 33 chapters are dealing with God's judgment, both on Israel and Judah, and then of course on these foreign nations. And we're about to get to the foreign nations in just a minute. But before we do that, we have another one of these shocking sign acts on the part of Ezekiel. And this one involves Ezekiel himself, where God tells him that his wife is going to die, and it's going to be as a sign to Israel. And ultimately, what's shocking about it is that Ezekiel is told by God not to mourn the death of his wife. Now, that will be shocking for today, and I know many of you can relate to that, but it would be also shocking in that context as well. Of course, this symbolizes ultimately the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem itself. So this delight of their eyes, but of course the people are told, and through the sign, not to mourn for the temple, the destruction of the temple that was about to happen, this national tragedy, this imminent national tragedy, because they would have no right to mourn because of their collective sin. And it was that sin that had ultimately brought that judgment upon the nation, upon their temple, and upon the children of Judah. So it's a pretty shocking judgment passage here in Ezekiel. That's Ezekiel 24. Let's move over to, we'll go over to 2 Corinthians chapter 10. So Paul's switching here in the argument for the rest of the book, really focusing on a defense of his apostleship. We see scattered throughout 2 Corinthians 10 here some of the accusations of Paul's opponents. So for instance, you read in verse 10, his letters, for they say his letters are weighty and strong, but his personal appearance is unimpressive. His speech is contemptible. His opponents also apparently are saying, Paul kind of does this in a tongue-in-cheek way in verse 1, where he says, I, Paul, myself urge you by the meekness and gentleness of Christ. I, who am meek when face to face with you, but bold toward you when I'm absent. So apparently his opponents were also saying, well, he sends these really bold letters, but when he gets to you face to face, he's not so bold. He's timid and meek. So Paul comes and he talks about the authority that has been given to him. And it's an authority, verse 8, which was given to him by the Lord. So he's defending his apostleship, that God had called him for the specific purpose ultimately, and this is the purpose of all authority within the church, I think, is for the building up of the church itself. So the Lord gave that authority, Paul says, to me for building you up and not destroying you. And he says, I will not be put to shame. At the end, he talks about how his sole boast is in the gospel of Jesus Christ. And he quotes, of course, from Jeremiah 9:24 here, for he who boasts is to boast in the Lord. And once again, he's saying that it's not me, it's the Lord. For it is not he who commends himself that is approved, but he whom the Lord commends. In other words, he's talking about his opponents who are basically commending themselves, and Paul's saying that my commendation comes from the Lord himself. 2 Corinthians 10. Moving over to 2 Samuel. So we're getting to the, we're still in that coup of Absalom over trying to take over the kingdom from his father David. And if you remember, there was, I believe it was in chapter 15, I could be wrong on that. In chapter 15, verse 31, that when one of David's advisors, Ahithophel, goes and is conspiring with Absalom against David, David prays that he would make the counsel of Ahithophel foolishness. Well, that prayer is answered here in this text. Remember that David still had had one of his advisors that he kind of planted in with Absalom, Hushai, and Hushai goes and gives Absalom some advice. So Ahithophel was saying that you need to go ahead and attack David that night. Well, Hushai gets him to do something else to delay it, and ultimately wins Absalom over. So here's this guy that David was on David's side, who was trying to save David, and ultimately he does, and gives David time to replenish his men, as happens at the end of this story, and also gives time for David to prepare for whatever battle might be coming. But once again, I can't, by the way, Ahithophel, because Absalom doesn't take his advice, he goes and kills himself. So it's a strange kind of episode here, but I can't help but think as I read through this, just how sad this is in the life of David, to have your own son rebelling against you like this and trying to take over your kingdom that God had granted to you. And even having to do things like sending a conspirator in with Absalom, it's just sad, seemingly. So things will get worse when we get to chapter 18, one of the low points in the life of David in chapter 18 with Absalom being slain. But that will be tomorrow. So that's 2 Samuel 17. And then finally, we'll get to Psalm here 72. Psalm 72 you'll notice is the last of the Psalms in book 2. So book 2 goes from Psalm 42 to 52. Remember that the Psalms are divided up into 5 separate books. And this is the last of those books. In fact, last of the Psalms in book 2. And you'll notice in verse 20, actually verses 18 through 20, you have 18 to 19 is kind of a benediction at the end of the book. And then verse 20 is a textual note, which basically says that the prayers of David, the son of Jesse, are ended. So this would have been added by whoever was compiling the Psalms when the Psalms were compiled together. So if they were written separately and then compiled together, this was placed at the end of that scroll saying, here the prayers are ended. And then, of course, it starts up with book 3 in Psalm 73. Blessing is a beautiful one there, by the way, at the end of it, praying that the whole earth be filled with his glory. Well, it always brings to mind to me Isaiah 6, where Isaiah sees the seraphim, the burning ones surrounding God's throne. And of course, there the confession is that the whole earth is in fact filled with his glory. The Psalm 72 is a Psalm of Solomon, and it is a prayer. It's a royal psalm, what we would call a royal psalm, that's focused on the king. What's interesting as you read through this is what the the king is celebrated for. He is one who will vindicate the afflicted of the people. Verse 4, he will save the children of the needy and crush the oppressor. He is one who will, once again in verse 12, deliver the needy when he cries for help, the afflicted also who has no helper. I have compassion on the poor and needy. Now, of course, what's interesting to me about all that is that if you read through the Torah, and what the Israelites were supposed to do to demonstrate their covenant relationship with God, this is what they were to do, right? They were to take care of the outcast, the poor, the widow, the orphan, those who in that society could not take care of themselves. That was a visible demonstration that they were being faithful to God in covenant relationship. Well, here is the king being celebrated as doing that, right? He was the one who was to lead the people in covenant relationship, in having that covenant relationship that was so deep and arising from the heart that it would result in them taking care of those who could not take care of themselves. In other words, reflecting the heart of God. But of course, we know that as you read through books like Kings, as we will shortly, and Chronicles, and even to a certain extent in Samuel, we see that the kings of Israel did not do this. Many times they did not take care of those who were unable to care for themselves. And it's so significant, I think, when we get to the stories in the Gospels, that Jesus is shown to be the one who is often doing that, right? Who is saving the children of the needy and those who are being oppressed, and those who are poor, and those who are afflicted, and those who are sick, and those who are outcast. Jesus goes to them. Jesus shows himself to be that true covenantal king celebrated here in Psalm 72. He is the one who ultimately is completely faithful to God in that covenant relationship and leading us to do the same. And in a sense, we need to mirror that same character, don't we? The character that goes to those who cannot help themselves sometimes, and who are at the mercy of society. And so much of what we do at New Prospect, and I'm so proud of our desire to serve our community, is for that purpose, is to show the character of Christ within our city, and in these relationships, and in these areas of need, to show the character of Christ. And again, as I mentioned on Sunday, this is not to make much of a New Prospect, but it's to make much of him, to make much of Jesus, and to show the love of Christ so that people might be drawn to Jesus. So hope that was an encouraging psalm to read through for you today on this day, September 21st, 2021. Hope you have a great rest of the day.